The morning sun cast long shadows across the cemetery outside Harmony Ridge, a small frontier town that had seen more than its share of death and hardship. Among the weathered headstones and wooden crosses, a solitary figure worked methodically, with pick and shovel, preparing another grave for another soul who had lost their battle with the harsh realities of frontier life. Nathaniel Nate Goodwin was 73 years old, and for the past 15 years, he had served as Harmony Ridge's Gravedigger, cemetery caretaker, and unofficial guardian of the dead. It was a job that had chosen him rather than the other way around after his wife Martha died. In the cholera epidemic of 1860, Nate had found solace in tending to the resting places of others who had passed on. Every morning, Nate would arrive at the cemetery before dawn, check his list of the recently departed, and begin the grim but necessary work of preparing their final resting places. In a town where the doctor was overworked, the preacher was often absent, and the undertaker was frequently drunk, Nate had become the one constant in the community's relationship with mortality. Today's grave was for little Emma Patterson, age 7, who had succumbed to the fever that had been sweeping through the town's children. As Nate dug, his weathered hands moving with the rhythm of long practice, he thought about all the small graves he'd prepared over the years. Too many children, he reflected. Far too many children. The work was harder now than it had been when he started. His arthritis made every shovelful an effort, and his failing eyesight sometimes made it difficult to keep the grave walls straight. But Nate persevered, driven by a sense of duty to the dead and their families that had sustained him through his own grief. As he reached the proper depth, 6 feet, as tradition demanded, Nate heard something that made him pause, a sound so faint he wasn't sure he'd heard it at all. A soft whimpering, like a kitten or a wounded bird. Nate climbed out of the grave and looked around the cemetery, thinking perhaps a stray animal had wandered in among the headstones. But he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar landscape of marble angels, iron crosses, and the occasional wilted flower left by grieving relatives. Returning to his work, Nate was smoothing the bottom of the grave when he heard the sound again. This time, there was no mistaking it, the cry of a human child, weak but unmistakably alive. And it was coming from beneath the ground. Nate's blood ran cold. In 15 years of cemetery work, he'd heard stories of people being buried alive, but he'd never encountered it himself. The sound seemed to be coming from the grave directly adjacent to the one he was digging, a grave that had been filled just 3 days earlier. According to the cemetery records, that grave held the body of Timothy Walsh, age 9, who had supposedly died of the same fever that had claimed Emma Patterson. The funeral had been rushed, as fever deaths often were, to prevent the spread of disease. With growing alarm, Nate grabbed his shovel and began digging frantically at the fresh grave. The earth was still loose, making the work easier, but every second felt like an eternity as the weak cries continued from below. "Hold on," Nate called out, though he wasn't sure if anyone could hear him. "I'm coming." As he dug deeper, the cries grew stronger, more insistent. Finally, his shovel struck with the lid of Timothy Walsh's coffin. Nate cleared away the remaining dirt and pried open the simple pine box with trembling hands. Inside, very much alive but weak from 3 days without food or water, was Timothy Walsh. The boy's eyes were wide with terror and confusion, his small face streaked with dirt and tears. He had somehow survived being buried alive, sustained by the small amount of air that had been trapped in the coffin. "It's all right, son," Nate said gently, lifting the boy from the coffin. "You're safe now. I've got you." Timothy clung to Nate with desperate strength, too frightened and weak to speak. The old Gravedigger wrapped the child in his coat and hurried toward town, his mind racing with questions and implications that made his stomach churn. How had this happened? How had a living child been pronounced dead and buried? And more disturbing still, if it had happened to Timothy, how many others might have suffered the same fate? Dr. Samuel Morrison was just opening his office when Nate burst through the door. With Timothy in his arms, the doctor, a harried man in his 50s who had been dealing with the fever outbreak for weeks, looked up in shock. "Good God, Nate, what's happened?" "Is that Timothy Walsh?" Nate said grimly. "Very much alive. Despite being buried 3 days ago, double quotes, Dr. Morrison's face went white. He had been the one to pronounce Timothy dead, the one who had signed the death certificate that led to the boy's burial. That's impossible. I checked for a pulse, for breathing. The boy was dead. Well, he ain't dead now, Nate replied, laying Timothy gently on the examination table. Doc, I need you to check him over, make sure he's all right. And then I need you to tell me how this could have happened. As Dr. Morrison examined Timothy, who was severely dehydrated but otherwise unharmed, a crowd began to gather outside the office. Word of the resurrection had spread quickly through the small town, and people were pressing against the windows to catch a glimpse of the boy, who had returned from the dead. Nate, Dr. Morrison said quietly, there have been cases, rare cases, where the fever causes a condition that mimics death so closely that even trained physicians can be fooled. The pulse becomes so weak as to be undetectable, breathing so shallow that it appears to stop entirely. It's called cataleptic sleep. You're saying Timothy was in some kind of coma. It's possible. The fever can cause the body to shut down almost completely as a survival mechanism, without proper equipment, without time for a thorough examination. Dr. Morrison's voice trailed off as the full implications hit him. Nate felt sick to his stomach. Doc, if this happened to Timothy, it could have happened to others. All those children we buried during the fever outbreak. The doctor's face was ashen. God help us all. We need to check the recent graves, all of them, if there are others. But even as he spoke, both men knew that for most of the recently buried, it was already too late. Timothy had survived 3 days in his coffin, but that was likely the absolute limit. Still, they had to try. Within an hour, half the town had gathered at the cemetery. Using Nate's detailed burial records, they began the grim task of exhuming recent graves, starting with the most recent burials. The work was backbreaking and emotionally devastating. Most of the graves held exactly what they expected to find. But as the sun reached its zenith, another miracle occurred. In the grave of Sarah Chen, a 12-year-old girl who had been buried just 2 days earlier, they found life. Like Timothy, Sarah was weak and terrified but alive, having survived in a cataleptic state that had fooled even the doctor's examination. By the end of that terrible day, they had saved 2 children and confirmed the deaths of 8 others who had truly passed away. But the discovery raised questions that would haunt Harmony Ridge for years to come. How many other victims of premature burial were there throughout the frontier? How many families had unknowingly buried their loved ones alive? That evening, as Timothy and Sarah recovered under Dr. Morrison's care, Nate sat alone in his small cabin, staring at the shovel that had become both his tool and his burden. For 15 years, he had thought he was serving the dead with dignity and respect. Now he wondered if he had been an unwitting participant in something far more horrible. Timothy Walsh's weak voice echoed in his memory. Mr. Goodwin, I called and called, but nobody came. I thought I was going to die down there. Nate made a decision that would change not only his own life, but the lives of countless others. He would never again simply assume that a grave held only the dead. From now on, every burial would be approached with the possibility that life might still flicker beneath the earth. But what Nate didn't know was that his discovery of living children in graves was about to attract the attention of some very dangerous people who had been deliberately using the confusion of the fever outbreak to hide their own dark crimes. Subscribe to our channel to see how Nate uncovers a conspiracy that goes far deeper than medical mistakes, and what lengths he'll go to protect the innocent. Don't miss this shocking tale of courage and justice. 2 weeks after the horrific discovery of children buried alive, Harmony Ridge had become a town transformed by fear and suspicion. The revelation that Timothy Walsh and Sarah Chen had nearly been buried alive had shaken the community's faith in their institutions and their neighbors. Families were demanding second opinions on all death pronouncements, and the cemetery had become a place of dread rather than peaceful rest. Nate Goodwin found himself at the center of the storm. What had begun as a routine day of gravedigging had turned him into an unwilling detective, investigating not just the medical mistakes that had nearly killed 2 children, but a growing pattern of irregularities that suggested something far more sinister. The first clue had come from Timothy Walsh himself. As the boy recovered his strength and his voice, he had shared disturbing memories from the days before his supposed death. He remembered being given medicine by someone who wasn't Dr. Morrison, a tall man with pale eyes, who had visited the Walsh house claiming to be a traveling physician, helping with the fever outbreak. He gave me a bitter drink, Timothy told Nate. During one of their conversations, said it would help me sleep better. After that, everything went dark and cold. Sarah Chen had similar memories. A strange doctor had visited her family, offering experimental treatments for the fever. She remembered the bitter taste, the gradual loss of consciousness, and then the terrifying awakening in darkness and earth. Nate brought these revelations to Sheriff Tom Bradley, a decent man who was overwhelmed by the implications of what might have been happening in his town. You're suggesting someone was deliberately drugging these children to make them appear dead? Bradley asked, his weathered face creased with disbelief. I'm not suggesting anything. Nate replied, I'm telling you what the children remember, and I'm asking you to help me figure out why someone would do such a thing. The answer came from an unexpected source, Martha Evans, the town's postmistress and unofficial keeper of all local gossip, approached Nate with information that made his blood run cold. Mr. Goodwin, she said nervously, I've been thinking about what you said, about checking for strange visitors around the time children got sick. There was a man called himself Dr. Aldrich who came through town about a month ago, said he was collecting medical specimens for research back east. What kind of specimens? Nate asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. Organs, bone samples, that sort of thing. Said he could pay good money for fresh specimens from fever victims. Most folks were too grief-stricken to think about it. But I saw him talking to Edmund Cray at the funeral parlor. Edmund Cray was Harmony Ridge's undertaker, a man who had struggled with drinking and financial problems for years. If he had been approached about selling body parts from the dead, desperation might have driven him to accept. Nate and Sheriff Bradley confronted Cray at his establishment, a grim building that served as both funeral parlor and carpentry shop. They found him drunk, as usual, but his reaction to their questions told them everything they needed to know. I didn't know, Cray wailed when pressed about Dr. Aldrich. He said the children were already dead, that taking specimens for medical research was helping science. He paid me $50 per body, more money than I'd seen in months, but they weren't dead. Were they? Nate said, his voice deadly quiet. You and this Aldrich were drugging children to make them appear dead, then selling their organs to medical schools back east. No, it wasn't supposed to work that way, Cray protested. Aldrich said the drug would just make them unconscious so we could harvest organs. Without the families knowing, he said they'd die naturally from the fever. Anyway, so we were just taking advantage of an inevitable situation. Sheriff Bradley grabbed Cray by the collar. You're telling me you were planning to cut organs out of living children? They were supposed to be unconscious. Aldrich said they wouldn't feel anything. I needed the money, my business was failing. My wife left me. I was desperate. The full horror of the conspiracy was becoming clear. Dr. Aldrich, whoever he really was, had been traveling from town to town during disease outbreaks, recruiting desperate undertakers to help him harvest organs from victims. The children weren't supposed to survive, they were supposed to remain unconscious while their organs were removed, ensuring they would never wake up to tell anyone what had happened. Timothy and Sarah had survived only because something had gone wrong. Perhaps Cray had given them the wrong dosage of the drug, or perhaps their young bodies had metabolized it differently than expected. Either way, they had been buried before the organ harvesting could take place, and their recovery in the grave had exposed the entire operation. Where is this Aldrich now? Bradley demanded. Gone, Cray sobbed. Left town the day after the burials. Said he'd be back in a few weeks to collect the specimens. He's supposed to return tomorrow night. Nate felt a cold fury building in his chest. For 15 years, he had dedicated his life to honoring the dead, ensuring they received proper burial and respect. To discover that someone had been using his cemetery as a source of body parts to sell, that children had been deliberately poisoned and buried alive as part of a criminal scheme, was more than he could bear. Sheriff, Nate said grimly, I think it's time we gave Dr. Aldrich a proper welcome when he comes back to town. That night, Nate, Sheriff Bradley, and a group of trusted townsmen waited in the cemetery for Aldrich's return. They had positioned themselves among the headstones, armed and ready to confront the man who had turned their place of rest into a source of horror. Aldrich arrived exactly when Cray had predicted, accompanied by two other men who were clearly hired muscle rather than medical professionals. They came equipped with shovels, medical bags, and what appeared to be a portable embalming table, everything needed to harvest organs from recently buried bodies. Cray, Aldrich called out as they approached the fresh graves. "Where are you? We have work to do." That's when Sheriff Bradley and his men emerged from hiding, surrounding the grave robbers with drawn weapons. "Dr. Aldrich, I presume," Bradley said, "or should I say, Mr. Marcus Thornton, wanted for medical fraud and murder in 3 territories." Aldrich, whose real name was indeed Marcus Thornton, tried to run, but found himself facing Nate Goodwin, who stood blocking his path with a shovel in his hands. "You almost murdered 2 children, Nate said quietly. "You turned my cemetery into your personal hunting ground. You've been stealing from the dead and trying to kill the living." "You don't understand," Thornton protested. "Medical science requires specimens. I was providing a valuable service. You were providing death," Nate replied. "And now you're going to face justice for it." As Sheriff Bradley arrested Thornton and his accomplices, Nate looked around at the cemetery that had been his responsibility for so many years. The headstones seemed to stand as silent witnesses to the crimes that had been committed among them. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. As they searched Thornton's wagon, they found records that revealed the true scope of his operation. Harmony Ridge had been just one stop on a circuit that included dozens of frontier towns. The list of victims was staggering: hundreds of people who had been drugged, buried alive, and then subjected to organ harvesting while unconscious. Most horrifying of all, they found a collection of children's personal belongings, toys, jewelry, clothing that Thornton had kept as trophies. Each item represented a young life that had been ended not by disease, but by deliberate murder disguised as medical research. "My God," Sheriff Bradley whispered as they examined the evidence. "How many children did this monster kill?" Nate looked at the collection of small shoes, dolls, and wooden toys, each one representing a child who had died in terror and darkness. "Too many," he said. "Far too many." As dawn broke over Harmony Ridge, the full extent of Thornton's crimes was becoming clear. But Nate knew that catching one monster wouldn't undo the damage that had been done. Somewhere out there, other towns were still vulnerable to similar predators. Other families were still at risk of losing their children to criminals who saw human life as nothing more than a source of profit. The old Gravedigger made another decision that would define the rest of his life. He would not just tend to the dead, he would protect the living. And he would make sure that what had happened in Harmony Ridge would never happen again anywhere. Don't miss the powerful conclusion where Nate transforms from Gravedigger to Guardian and ensures justice reaches beyond one small town. Subscribe now to see how one man's courage changes everything. 6 months after the arrest of Marcus Thornton and the exposure of his organ harvesting conspiracy, Harmony Ridge had begun to heal from the trauma that had nearly destroyed the community's faith in itself. But for Nate Goodwin, the discovery of children buried alive had marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that would transform him from a simple gravedigger into something much more significant. The trial of Marcus Thornton had been a sensation that drew attention from newspapers across the territory. His conviction on charges of murder, fraud, and desecration of human remains had resulted in a death sentence that was carried out with swift frontier justice. But for Nate, Thornton's execution was only the beginning of his mission to ensure that such horrors could never happen again. Using the evidence they had gathered from Thornton's wagon, Nate had compiled a list of other towns that had been victimized by the organ harvesting ring. With the support of territorial authorities and a growing network of concerned citizens, he had begun visiting these communities to investigate suspicious deaths and expose similar crimes. What he found was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Thornton had been just one member of a larger criminal organization that had been operating across the frontier for years, taking advantage of disease outbreaks, isolated communities, and overwhelmed medical systems to harvest organs for sale. to unscrupulous medical schools and private collectors. In town after town, Nate's investigations had uncovered evidence of children and adults who had been deliberately poisoned and buried alive. Some had died during the organ harvesting process, while others had simply been left to suffocate in their graves. The total number of victims was staggering: hundreds of people whose deaths had been attributed to disease when they had actually been murdered for profit. But Nate's work had also saved lives. In 3 different towns, his arrival had prevented similar conspiracies from claiming more victims. His reputation as the man who could tell the difference between natural death and criminal murder had spread throughout the territory, making him a feared figure among those who would prey on the vulnerable. Today, Nate was returning to Harmony Ridge after a month-long investigation in the Colorado Territory. He was tired, older than his 74 years, but also filled with a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since Martha's death. As his wagon crested the hill overlooking his hometown, he was surprised to see a crowd gathered in the town square. Sheriff Bradley met him at the edge of town, a smile on his weathered face. "Welcome home, Nate. The town council has something they want to show you." As they walked toward the square, Nate could see that the crowd was gathered around something new, a monument of some kind, carved from beautiful white marble and standing about 8 feet tall. As they drew closer, he could read the inscription carved into its face: "In memory of all who died before their time, and in honor of Nathaniel Goodwin, guardian of the living, who ensures that the dead rest in peace and the living remain safe from those who would do them harm." Below the inscription were the names of all the verified victims of Thornton's conspiracy, both in Harmony Ridge and in the other towns Nate had investigated. At the base of the monument, fresh flowers had been placed by family members and friends who wanted to ensure their loved ones were never forgotten. "The territorial governor commissioned it," Sheriff Bradley explained. "Said your work exposing these crimes has saved more lives than any law enforcement effort in frontier history. They want to make you an official territorial investigator with authority to investigate suspicious deaths anywhere in the region." Nate was moved almost to tears by the recognition, but his attention was drawn to 2 familiar figures standing near the monument. Timothy Walsh and Sarah Chen, now healthy and strong, approached him with shy smiles. "Mr. Goodwin," Timothy said, "we wanted to thank you again for saving our lives, and we wanted you to know that we're not afraid anymore." Sarah nodded in agreement. "When I have nightmares about being in the dark, I remember that you came for us. You didn't give up, and that makes me feel safe." As Nate knelt down to embrace the children he had pulled from their graves, he felt the weight of all the victims he hadn't been able to save. But he also felt the strength that came from knowing that Timothy and Sarah would grow up, have families of their own, and live full lives because he had been willing to listen to the voices crying out from beneath the earth. Dr. Morrison approached, carrying an official-looking document. "Nate, I've been working with medical schools throughout the territory to establish new protocols for determining death. No one will be buried again without multiple examinations and a waiting period to ensure they're truly gone. Your discovery has revolutionized how we handle death certification." The new protocols were already showing results. In the past 6 months, 3 cases of cataleptic sleep had been identified and treated properly, saving 3 more lives that might otherwise have been lost to premature burial. Mayor Williams stepped forward with a key and a badge. "Nate, by the authority vested in me by the territorial government, I hereby appoint you as special investigator for suspicious deaths, with jurisdiction throughout the Montana Territory and beyond. Your job is to protect the living and ensure justice for the dead." As the crowd cheered, Nate looked around at the faces of his friends and neighbors, people who had trusted him with their most precious possessions, their departed loved ones, and who now trusted him to protect their living children from those who would harm them. That evening, as the celebration wound down, Nate found himself back in the cemetery where his new life had begun. He stood before Martha's grave, telling her about the day's events and the work that lay ahead. "I know you'd be proud of me, Martha," he said. "Quietly, I found a way to honor the dead by protecting the living. It's not the retirement we planned, but it's work that matters." A soft voice behind him made him turn. Timothy Walsh had followed him to the cemetery, no longer afraid of the place where he had nearly died. "Mr. Goodwin," the boy said, "my ma wanted me to ask you something. She said that since you saved my life, you're part of our family now. She wanted to know if you'd like to come live with us instead of staying alone in your cabin." Nate felt his heart swell with emotion. After years of isolation and loneliness, he was being offered something he had thought was lost forever: family. "Timothy," he said, "I'd be honored to be part of your family, but I want you to know that you're part of mine now too, you and Sarah, and all the children I've been able to help. You're all my family." As they walked back toward town together, Nate reflected on the strange path that had brought him to this moment. He had started as a simple gravedigger, a man whose job was to bury the dead and tend their resting places. But fate had given him the opportunity to become something more: a guardian who stood between the innocent and those who would harm them. The work ahead would be difficult and sometimes dangerous. There were still criminals out there who saw human life as a commodity to be bought and sold. There were still towns where the vulnerable were preyed upon by those who should protect them. But Nate was no longer alone in his mission. He had the support of territorial authorities, the cooperation of honest lawmen, and most importantly, the knowledge that his work was making a real difference in the lives of real people. Years later, when children throughout the territory heard stories about the brave man who could tell the difference between sleeping and dead, who had saved countless lives by listening to voices others couldn't hear, they would learn about Nathaniel Goodwin, the guardian of the living. And in cemeteries across the frontier, better protocols and procedures ensured that no one would ever again be buried alive, that the dead would rest in peace and the living would remain safe from those who would do them. Nate's greatest legacy wasn't the monument in Harmony Ridge's town square, or the official recognition from territorial authorities. It was the knowledge that somewhere, children were growing up safe and healthy because one old gravedigger had been willing to listen to a cry for help from beneath the earth and had refused to ignore it. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of courage, justice, and redemption. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful Western stories that prove one person's determination can change the world and save countless lives.